When Caleb Winters thrust his arm into the flames to free a tortured stallion, he thought he was simply saving one horse's life, but by dawn, 300 wild horses had surrounded his isolated Wyoming ranch in 1859, forming a living wall of protection around the man who'd sacrificed his own flesh for one of their own. What happens when a lonely cowboy discovers that sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't fighting against the wilderness, but becoming worthy of its respect? Wind howled across the empty land like a hungry wolf searching for prey. Caleb Winters pressed his back against the wooden fence post, watching dark clouds roll toward his small ranch in the Wyoming territory. The year 1859 had brought nothing but trouble, and this storm looked meaner than most. His coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but he kept the tin cup in his hands anyway. The warmth helped him forget how alone he was out here, miles from the nearest neighbor. Most folks in Cedar Falls thought he was crazy for living so far from town. Maybe they were right. The cattle huddled together near the barn, sensing the coming weather. Smart animals knew when to stick together. Unlike him, Caleb had been on his own for 3 years now, ever since his brother died in a mining accident. Some days the silence felt heavier than the mountains themselves. A rumble of thunder made the ground shake beneath his boots. But something else caught his attention. Hoofbeats coming fast from the east. Nobody rode this hard, unless trouble was chasing them, or they were bringing it with them. Caleb set down his cup and walked toward the sound. His rifle leaned against the porch rail, close enough to grab if needed. Living alone taught a man to be careful about unexpected visitors. The rider appeared over the hill, like a black shadow against the gray sky. Even from a distance, Caleb could see the horse was magnificent, tall, strong, and running like its life depended on it. But something was wrong. The animal's stride looked uneven, and foam flew from its mouth with each desperate breath. As the horse got closer, Caleb saw the rider clinging to the saddle. It was a young woman with dark hair whipping in the wind. Her face was pale with fear, and she kept looking back over her shoulder like something terrible was following her. "Help me!" she called out as the horse stumbled to a stop near the fence. "Please, you have to help us." The horse was breathing so hard its sides heaved like a bellows. Sweat mixed with blood on its black coat, and one of its legs trembled with each step. This animal had been pushed beyond its limits. Caleb hurried forward, his hands already reaching for the horse's bridle. "Easy there, boy. Easy now." His voice was calm despite the worry growing in his chest. Whatever had driven them here must have been serious. The woman slid from the saddle, nearly falling when her legs wouldn't hold her weight. "My father's men are coming," she gasped. "They want to take Midnight back, but they'll kill him with their methods. This horse isn't meant to be broken." Lightning split the sky above them, and in that brief flash of light, Caleb saw something in the horse's dark eyes that made his heart skip. It wasn't just fear, it was intelligence, spirit, and a desperate plea for understanding. What kind of men would chase a woman and her horse through a storm? And why did this beautiful animal look more terrified of its owners than the wild weather bearing down on them? 6 riders appeared on the ridge like vultures circling a kill. Caleb counted them quickly, too many for a friendly visit, too few for a fair fight. The woman beside him grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve with fear. "That's them," she whispered. "That's my father and his men." The lead rider sat tall in his saddle, wearing clothes too fancy for ranch work. His silver spurs caught the dim light as he urged his mount down the slope. Behind him, 5 hard-looking men spread out in a line, their hands resting on their gun belts. "Elizabeth," the man's voice boomed across the open ground, "stop this foolishness and come home. You're making a spectacle of yourself." The woman Elizabeth stepped closer to her horse, one hand on the animal's neck. "I won't let you destroy him, father. Not like you did to the others." Caleb felt the tension crackling in the air like electricity before a lightning strike. Family fights were dangerous enough, but when they involved armed men and valuable horses, blood usually followed. "Sir," the lead rider called to Caleb, "I'm Cornelius Ashford, and that's my daughter. She's taken leave of her senses and stolen my property." He pointed at the black horse with a gloved hand. "I'll pay you well to help me retrieve what belongs to me." The horse Midnight, Elizabeth had called him, pressed closer to the young woman. Caleb had seen enough animals in his life to recognize the signs. This horse trusted her completely but feared the approaching men with every fiber of his being. "The horse doesn't look stolen," Caleb said carefully. "Looks like he chose to come here." Ashford's face darkened like the storm clouds overhead. Animals don't choose, Mr. Winters. Caleb Winters. Mr. Winters, animals are property. Nothing more. They exist to serve their owner's purposes. My daughter has filled this horse's head with nonsense about partnership and respect. He spat the last word like it tasted bitter. What this animal needs is proper discipline. One of Ashford's men rode closer, pulling a long rope from his saddle. The sight of it made Midnight rear up on his hind legs, his hooves pawing the air in panic. Elizabeth barely managed to stay out of the way. Please, she said to Caleb, her eyes bright with unshed tears. You can see what they've done to him. Look at the scars on his flanks. The way he flinches from their ropes. They call it training, but it's torture. Caleb did look, and what he saw made his stomach turn. Faint white lines crisscrossed the horse's black hide old whip marks that told a story of pain and fear. Fresh cuts showed where spurs had dug too deep, and the animal's eyes held the haunted look of a creature that had learned to expect cruelty from human hands. Some methods work faster than others, Ashford said, noticing Caleb's expression. Sentiment has no place in business, Mr. Winters. Surely a man living alone in this wilderness understands the importance of control. Thunder crashed overhead, and the first fat raindrops began to fall. The storm was almost upon them, but Caleb barely noticed the weather. His attention was fixed on the trembling horse, and the young woman who stood between the animal and the men who would break its spirit. What did a lonely rancher owe to strangers who brought their troubles to his door? And could he live with himself if he turned away from a creature that needed his protection? The black horse's terrible scream cut through the night like a knife through paper. Caleb jumped from his bed, his heart pounding as orange light danced on his cabin walls. Outside, men were shouting and laughing while something much worse was happening. He grabbed his boots and ran to the window. What he saw made his stomach twist with anger. Ashford's men had trapped the beautiful black stallion inside a circle of burning sticks. The poor animal threw himself against the flaming walls again and again, trying to escape. Each time he hit the fire, sparks flew up like angry stars. "Come on out, Winters!" Ashford called from near the barn. "Want to see what happens to things that don't do what they're told?" The horse screamed again. This time, Caleb could see why. One of the burning branches had caught the stallion's front leg. The smell of burning hair filled the air. The magnificent animal was being tortured, and these men thought it was funny. Caleb dropped his rifle by the door. He couldn't watch this happen. Not to any living thing. "You're crazy!" one of Ashford's men yelled as Caleb climbed over the fence. "That horse will kill you!" But Caleb was already moving toward the panicked animal. The stallion's eyes were wide with fear and pain. His whole body shook as the flames licked at his beautiful black coat. Caleb had worked with scared horses before. He knew they could sense if someone wanted to help them. "Easy, boy," he said softly, even though his own heart was racing. "I'm here to help." The burning branch was wrapped around the horse's leg like a rope made of fire. There was only one way to get it off quickly enough. Caleb would have to use his own arm to push it away. He didn't think about the pain. He didn't think about what might happen to him. He only thought about the terrified animal that needed his help. Caleb shoved his left arm between the burning wood and the horse's leg. The fire bit into his skin like 1,000 angry bees. The pain was so bad he almost fainted. But he held on until the branch broke apart. The stallion leaped over the broken fence and disappeared into the darkness. Caleb fell to his knees in the dirt. His arm felt like it was still on fire. Through the pain, he could hear Ashford cursing and his men stamping out the remaining flames. "You fool!" Ashford shouted. "That horse was worth more than your entire ranch." But Caleb wasn't listening. He was watching the place where the black stallion had vanished into the night. For the first time in years, he had done something that truly mattered. Dr. Hensley's wagon rattled up to Caleb's cabin just as the sun painted the eastern sky pink. The old doctor had ridden through the night after someone from town told him about the fire. His medical bag bounced on the seat beside him as his tired horse came to a stop. "Let me see that arm," Doc Hensley said, climbing down from his wagon. He was a thin man, with kind eyes and gentle hands that had fixed everything from broken bones to broken hearts across the Wyoming territory. Caleb sat at his kitchen table while the doctor unwrapped the torn shirt he had used to cover his burns. The skin was red and blistered, but it could have been much worse. "You're lucky you won't lose the arm," Doc Hensley said, cleaning the wounds with careful movements. though you'll carry these marks for the rest of your life." Through the kitchen window, they could see Ashford's men picking up pieces of burned wood from the night before. The men looked tired and angry. Their boss had not been happy about losing his valuable horse. "Why did you do it?" the doctor asked, as he wrapped clean white cloth around Caleb's arm. "Risk everything for an animal that didn't even belong to you?" Caleb watched a red-tailed hawk circle high above his ranch. The bird was free to go wherever it wanted. Nobody could put it in a cage or hurt it just to prove they were stronger. "That horse had the most beautiful eyes I've ever seen," Caleb said quietly. "They weren't meant to be filled with fear and pain. Some things shouldn't be destroyed just because they won't give up their spirit." Doc Hensley nodded as he tied the last knot in the bandage. He had seen enough cruelty in his years as a doctor. It was rare to meet someone willing to stand against it. "Ashford's been buying ranches from here to Cheyenne," the doctor warned. "Men like him don't forget when someone makes them look foolish. Then he shouldn't bring his business to my land." The sound of horses approaching made them both look toward the window. Ashford himself was riding up with 4 other men, but something was different about the way he sat in his saddle. The confidence from the night before had been replaced by barely controlled anger. "This isn't finished, Winters," Ashford shouted from horseback. "Nobody makes Cornelius Ashford look like a fool and walks away without paying for it." But his words didn't seem as frightening in the morning light. As the riders disappeared over the hill, Doc Hensley packed his instruments with a thoughtful expression on his weathered face. "You know something interesting?" he said as he prepared to leave. "That stallion you saved? Word around town is it belongs to Ashford's daughter. Apparently, it's her most prized possession." Thunder rolled across the morning sky, but it wasn't coming from the clouds. Caleb stepped onto his porch and froze. Horses. Everywhere. A sea of brown, black, white, and spotted coats stretched beyond his fence line like a living carpet. His coffee cup slipped from his good hand and shattered on the wooden boards. The black stallion stood closest to the house, his dark eyes watching Caleb with something that looked almost like gratitude. Behind him, wild mustangs mixed with ranch horses, carriage animals alongside workhorses. Some bore saddle marks. Others had never felt a rope. Yet they all stood together, quiet as church mice, waiting. "What in tarnation?" Caleb whispered, his bandaged arm throbbing as he gripped the porch rail. 3 days ago, he'd saved 1 horse. Now hundreds surrounded his small ranch like they were protecting him from something. Dust clouds appeared on the horizon. Riders were coming fast, and Caleb knew exactly who they were. His stomach dropped like a stone in a well. Cornelius Ashford wasn't the type of man to forget being embarrassed, especially not in front of his hired guns. The horses seemed to sense the approaching danger. Their ears pricked forward, and several of the larger stallions moved closer to form a wall between the ranch house and the distant riders. The black stallion snorted and pawed the ground, his muscles tight as coiled springs. "Easy, boy," Caleb said, stepping down from the porch despite every instinct screaming at him to run inside and bar the door. "I don't know what you're all doing here, but—" The thundering hoofbeats grew louder. Ashford's voice carried across the prairie like a war cry. "Winters, you can't hide behind stolen horses forever." But as the riders drew closer, something strange happened. The horses didn't scatter like Caleb expected. Instead, they pressed together tighter, creating an unbroken barrier of flesh and determination. The wild mustangs stood shoulder to shoulder with gentle farm horses, all united by something Caleb couldn't understand. Ashford and his men pulled up short, their own mounts dancing nervously at the sight of so many free horses. The businessman's face was red with anger, but Caleb could see fear creeping into his eyes too. Even a fool could recognize the power in what stood before them. "This is impossible," Ashford shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "Horses don't act like this. They don't choose sides." The black stallion stepped forward, placing himself directly between Caleb and the armed riders. His neck arched proudly, and he let out a challenge that echoed across the plains like a battle horn. Other horses joined in, creating a chorus that made the earth itself seem to tremble. Caleb felt tears prick his eyes. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone. These magnificent creatures had somehow understood what he'd done for one of their own, and they'd come to return the favor. The lonely cowboy who'd given his arm to save a horse now had an army of protectors he never could have imagined. A single rifle shot split the morning air like breaking glass. Every horse's head snapped toward the sound, but none fled. Ashford held his smoking gun high, his face twisted with rage and something darker. I'll shoot every last one of these beasts if that's what it takes. Lower your weapon, Ashford. The new voice cut through the tension like a knife through butter. Colonel James Weatherby rode up from the south, his blue uniform crisp despite the early hour. Behind him came a small group of soldiers, but they kept their guns holstered. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. The territorial commander was known for being fair, but he was still the law. If Ashford could convince him that the horses were stolen property, everything could go wrong fast. "Colonel," Ashford said, trying to sound reasonable while still holding his rifle, "this man has used some kind of trickery to steal my animals and turn them against their rightful owners." Weatherby dismounted and walked slowly through the gathered horses. The animals made room for him without showing fear, which seemed to surprise the old soldier. His weathered face showed nothing as he examined the scene, but his sharp eyes missed nothing. "That's an interesting theory," the colonel said finally, "but I've been hearing different stories in town. Stories about a man who burned his own arm to save a horse from torture." The black stallion moved closer to Weatherby, allowing the soldier to touch his neck. The gesture was so trusting, so peaceful, that it spoke louder than any words could have. "This horse shows no signs of mistreatment now," Weatherby observed. "In fact, he seems remarkably healthy for an animal that was supposedly being properly trained." "Father, that's enough." A woman's voice rang out across the gathering. Everyone turned to see a young lady riding hard from the direction of town, her dark hair streaming behind her like a banner. She pulled up beside the black stallion, who immediately nuzzled her shoulder with gentle affection. "Elizabeth, get away from there," Ashford snapped. "These animals are dangerous." "Dangerous?" Elizabeth Ashford's eyes blazed with fury as she dismounted. "The only dangerous thing here was your so-called training methods. This man saved Midnight's life while you tried to break his spirit with fire and pain." The pieces clicked together in Caleb's mind. This was Ashford's daughter, the horse's real owner. And from the way she looked at her father, she knew exactly what kind of man he really was. Colonel Weatherby studied the family drama with the patience of someone who'd seen plenty of human foolishness. "Miss Ashford, is this your horse?" "Yes, sir. And if Mr. Winters hadn't risked his own safety, Midnight would be dead right now because of my father's cruelty." The gathered horses seemed to sense the shift in the conversation. Some began drifting away, their protective duty apparently complete, but many remained. The black stallion stayed firmly planted between Caleb and anyone who might wish him harm. Weatherby looked at Ashford with disgust. "Sir, I suggest you reconsider your business practices in this territory. We need men like Mr. Winters here, people who understand that real strength doesn't require breaking spirits." As the confrontation wound down, Caleb realized something had changed forever. The lonely cowboy who'd lived in isolation had somehow become the center of something larger than himself. The door crashed open before anyone could knock. Elizabeth Ashford stumbled into Caleb's small kitchen, her dress torn and mud-stained, her eyes wide with fear. Behind her, Midnight paced frantically in the yard, his neighing sharp with alarm. "They're coming," she gasped, clutching the doorframe. "My father's men. He's convinced the territorial governor that you've stolen valuable livestock using some kind of witchcraft." Caleb's blood turned cold. Witchcraft charges in 1859 meant hanging or worse. "How much time do we have?" "Minutes, maybe less." Elizabeth's voice shook. "But I know where we can hide. There's a canyon system about 5 miles north. The horses showed me." Outside, dust clouds appeared on the horizon. At least 20 riders, moving fast. Caleb grabbed his rifle and the small bag of supplies he always kept ready. Living alone taught a man to prepare for quick departures. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, as they rushed toward Midnight. "Because you're the first person who ever looked at my horse and saw a partner instead of property." Elizabeth swung onto Midnight's back with practiced ease. "And because my father's wrong about a lot of things." They rode hard toward the canyon lands, Midnight's powerful stride eating up the miles. Behind them, angry shouts echoed across the prairie as Ashford's men reached the empty ranch. Caleb glanced back to see smoke rising from his barn. "He's burning everything," Elizabeth whispered, her face pale. Buildings can be rebuilt, Caleb replied, though his heart ached watching years of work disappear in flames. What matters is that we're alive. The canyon entrance was hidden behind a wall of scrub brush. Inside, the walls rose hundreds of feet on either side, creating a natural fortress. But they weren't alone. Dozens of horses filled the narrow space. Mustangs, ranch horses, even some of Ashford's own breeding stock. They followed us. Elizabeth breathed in wonder. Just like that morning at your ranch. An old Mustang mare approached them, her coat silver with age. She touched noses with midnight, then turned to study Caleb with intelligent eyes. Around them, the other horses shifted restlessly, as if waiting for something. What are they doing? Caleb asked. Elizabeth slid down from Midnight's back, her eyes bright with understanding. They're choosing sides, and they've chosen you. From the canyon entrance came the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Ashford's voice boomed off the rock walls. There's nowhere left to run, Winters. Come out and face justice. But as the first riders appeared at the canyon mouth, they stopped dead. The sight of hundreds of horses blocking their path was enough to give even armed men pause. The animals stood shoulder to shoulder, creating an impenetrable wall of flesh and determination. Ashford himself rode forward, his face twisted with rage. Elizabeth, get away from that criminal. The only criminal here, Elizabeth called back, her voice steady now, is the man who burns down homes and tortures innocent animals. Behind Ashford, his men shifted uncomfortably. Setting fire to a man's property was one thing, but facing down this many horses was another matter entirely. Several of the riders were already backing away from the canyon entrance. The old mare stepped forward, positioning herself directly between Ashford and his daughter. Her ears flattened against her skull, and she bared her teeth in a clear warning. The message was unmistakable. No one would harm the people under her protection. This is impossible, Ashford snarled. Horses don't. They don't organize like this. Maybe, Caleb called from deep within the canyon. You never gave them reason to. Lightning split the sky above the canyon, followed by thunder that shook the rock walls. 3 days had passed since the standoff began, and neither side seemed willing to back down. Rain poured through the narrow opening above, turning the canyon floor into a muddy stream. We can't stay here forever, Elizabeth said, sharing her meager breakfast of hardtack with Caleb. Around them, the horses huddled together for warmth, their coats steaming in the damp air. Your father's men are getting restless, Caleb observed, nodding toward the canyon entrance. Heard some of them talking about heading back to town. But even as he spoke, new riders appeared through the rain. Colonel Weatherby's uniform was unmistakable, even soaked through. Behind him rode Doc Hensley, and surprisingly, the sheriff from Cedar Falls. Ashford, the colonel's voice cut through the storm. I'm ordering you to stand down. On whose authority? Ashford shouted back, rain streaming from his hat brim. On the authority of the territorial government, which doesn't take kindly to men who burn down homesteads and make false accusations. Weatherby dismounted and walked toward the horses, who parted to let him through. False accusations? Ashford's face reddened. That man stole my property. Actually, came a new voice from behind the colonel. He saved it. A young man in city clothes stepped forward, his notebook already soggy from the rain. I'm Daniel Mackenzie from the Denver Herald. Been investigating reports of unusual horse behavior throughout the territory. Elizabeth gasped. You're the reporter who's been writing about animal intelligence. That's right. And what I found here is remarkable. Mackenzie pulled out his pencil, despite the weather. 3 separate witnesses from Cedar Falls confirmed that Mr. Winters risked his life to save a horse from torture. The gathering of hundreds of horses around his ranch wasn't theft, it was recognition. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard, Ashford sputtered. Is it? Colonel Weatherby asked. Because I've seen horses follow men they trust into battle. Seen them refuse to leave wounded soldiers behind. Animals understand loyalty better than most people. The old mare, who had been protecting them, stepped forward once again. But this time, instead of showing aggression, she walked directly to Colonel Weatherby and lowered her head. The gesture was unmistakable, a sign of respect from one leader to another. Well, I'll be, Doc Hensley whispered. She's acknowledging his authority. One by one, Ashford's men began backing away from the canyon entrance. Without their support, the wealthy rancher looked smaller somehow, diminished by the magnitude of what he was witnessing. Father, Elizabeth called softly. "It's over. You've lost." But Ashford wasn't finished. With a roar of rage, he spurred his horse forward, directly toward the protective wall of animals. His intent was clear. If he couldn't have his way, he'd scatter the horses with violence. Midnight met him halfway. The black stallion reared up, his hooves flashing in the gray light. But he didn't strike instead. He planted himself firmly between Ashford and the others, his message crystal clear. This far, and no further. For a long moment, man and horse faced each other in the pouring rain. Then, slowly, Ashford's shoulders sagged in defeat. The fight went out of him all at once, leaving behind only a tired old man who had forgotten the difference between respect and fear. "Keep him," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Keep them all. I'm too old to learn new ways." As Ashford rode away with his remaining men, the canyon filled with an almost electric sense of possibility. The storm was passing, and shafts of sunlight began breaking through the clouds. "What happens now?" Caleb asked. Colonel Weatherby smiled. "Now you go home and rebuild. The territorial government will provide compensation for your losses, and I suspect you'll have plenty of help." He was right. By evening, half the town of Cedar Falls had arrived at Caleb's burned ranch, carrying lumber and tools and enough food to feed an army. They worked through the night, guided by lantern light and the occasional whinny from horses who had chosen to stay. As dawn broke over the Wyoming territory in 1859, Caleb Winters stood in the doorway of his new barn, watching midnight graze peacefully in the pasture. His scarred arm ached in the morning chill, but the pain felt different now, not like punishment, but like a reminder of what truly mattered. Elizabeth approached from the house, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. "The reporter wants to interview you for his story." "What story would that be?" "The one about how sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is choose compassion over cruelty, even when nobody's watching." She handed him the coffee, her eyes bright with hope. "The one about how true strength comes from protecting what's vulnerable, not conquering what's weak." In the distance, a small herd of mustangs grazed alongside the domestic horses, wild and tame sharing the same space in perfect harmony. It was a sight that would have been impossible just days before, but somehow felt perfectly natural now. The Wyoming territory stretched endlessly in all directions, vast and full of promise. And for the first time in his life, Caleb Winters understood that he wasn't alone in it, had never truly been alone at all. Sometimes salvation came not in the form of rescue, but in the simple recognition that courage, once shown, creates ripples that extend far beyond what the eye can see.